I didn't mean to enlist in the Ashborn Legion. It was one line on a requisition form, one digit, swapped by a supply clerk who probably never even looked up from his coffee. Now, I was standing in a loading bay, surrounded by 9-foot-tall alien war priestesses who stared at me like I'd walked out of their dinner plate, and every single one of them was turning to face me at once. My name is Marcus Doyle. Before this, I was a field medic attached to the 62nd Colonial Rangers under Colonel Reyes. I stitched wounds, set bones, and once talked a panicking recruit through his own appendectomy over a comlink because the surgeon was 2 systems away. I was good at my job, which in the military is always a punishment in disguise. My transfer orders were supposed to send me to Outpost Varen, a quiet joint species medical station on the rim, patching up bored engineers and calibrating auto docks until my rotation ended. Instead, a logistics officer named Halverson, a man who deserves a war crimes tribunal for his paperwork alone, routed me to the Ashborn compound. I didn't realize the mistake until the shuttle doors opened. The air outside smelled like scorched iron and something floral underneath it, sweet and wrong. I grabbed my duffel, expecting a tired quartermaster and a stack of forms. Instead, I found myself standing under a black iron archway draped in bone-white banners, the sigil of the Vale Ashborn burned into the steel above me. The Vale are allies, officially, but they aren't like us. Their entire society runs on a warrior matriarchy so absolute that their males are kept cloistered on the homeworld, gentle and small, tending gardens while the females go to war. The females stand 9 feet tall, skin the color of dried blood, eyes like burning coals set deep in armored faces. They are, without exaggeration, the single most feared infantry force in the known galaxy. And I had just walked directly into the barracks of their most elite unit, the Ashborn Legion, an all-female death cult of soldiers who hadn't lost a campaign in 300 years. I held my datapad up to the scanner. It beeped green. The blast door hissed open behind me with a horrible sense of finality, sealing shut the second I stepped through. The room went dead silent. Dozens of towering, blood-red warriors stopped mid-motion. Blades stilled. Conversation died. Every glowing eye in that barracks locked onto me at the exact same moment, and they all started walking toward me.
I am 6'2", which back home earns me a watch your head at most doorways. In that room, I felt like a rabbit that had wandered into a den of wolves that had just noticed dinner arrived early. A figure separated from the crowd near the far wall, taller than the rest by half a head, her crimson skin marked with pale ritual scars that ran from her jaw down into her collar. A rank sigil was burned into the pauldron on her shoulder. Her translator collar pulsed a dull orange as it activated. "What?" she said, her voice a low, grinding rumble that I felt in my sternum more than heard. "Is a Terran male doing inside my hull?" "Reporting for duty, ma'am," I said, and my voice only cracked a little. I held up my datapad. "Marcus Doyle, transferred in from the 62nd. Orders say Ashborn Legion, effective immediately."
She crossed the distance in 2 strides and didn't so much as glance at the pad. She leaned down instead, close enough that I could see the faint embers glowing behind her irises. "This is the Legion," she said. "We are the blade that ends wars before they begin. We do not shelter soft little healers." "I can see that, Commander," I said, holding my ground because moving felt more dangerous than staying still. "But my transfer's logged with Central. Reversing it takes 3 to 4 weeks minimum. Until then, I'm technically your problem." A ripple of low growls moved through the room. One of the warriors, broader than the commander, a massive cleaving axe resting across her shoulders like it weighed nothing, stepped forward. "Let me test him, warlord," she said, and her translator rendered the words with an almost cheerful menace. Drop him in the endurance pit. Saves us from carrying dead weight into the field. I swallowed hard. With respect, Sergeant, I've pulled bodies out of the Kesserine trenches under active fire. I'm not here to fight you, but I'm not leaving either. The commander studied me for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then she let out a sharp bark of a laugh that echoed off the iron walls. Kesserine, she repeated. She straightened to her full towering height, arms folding across her chest plate. Fine, little healer. You want to play soldier? Stay. But there are no accommodations for your species here. You eat what we eat, you train how we train, and if you fall behind, we leave you where you fall. Welcome to the Legion. She turned her back. The others slowly returned to their business, though I could feel their eyes tracking me the entire walk to an empty bunk shoved into the coldest, farthest corner of the room.
The next 3 weeks nearly killed me. The Veil don't consider a training session successful unless someone leaves it bleeding. Morning started at 0400 with a run through the compound's gravity chamber, cranked to 2.2 times standard. On Earth, running feels like running. In that chamber, it felt like sprinting with a second body strapped to my back. The Veil jogged like it was nothing, their long, armored strides eating distance I had to fight for. I fell behind almost instantly, lungs burning, legs screaming. "Move, Terran," the axe sergeant, I'd learned her name was Kessa, barked as she lapped me effortlessly. "Or should I carry you like a wounded pet?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just kept my head down and matched my breathing to my own footsteps.
Here's the thing about humans that other species always underestimate. We're not the strongest, the fastest, or the toughest. But we are built to endure. Persistence hunters, all the way back to the savannah. Our bodies regulate heat and keep going long after bigger, denser muscle gives out. By the 8th kilometer, the taunts started fading. The Veil were panting now, their heavy frames retaining heat they couldn't shed fast enough. By the 10th, half of them had slowed to a hard march. I was still running. Ugly, shuffling, but running. When I crossed the finish line, I collapsed onto the deck plating, vision swimming with static. A shadow fell over me. Rin, the unit's scout, leaner than the others, eyes a sharp amber instead of red. She crouched and offered a canteen without a word.
"You did not die," she said, sounding almost disappointed. "Not today," I wheezed and drank. It tasted like rust and salt, but I didn't care. "Your body is strange," she said, poking my shoulder with a clawed finger. "It weeps water, and yet it does not stop. Kessa said you would quit by kilometer 3. Tell Kessa I'm just getting started." Training was only half the war. The social hierarchy was worse. I was small, male, and an outsider, which placed me at the very bottom of a very rigid ladder. I got shoved to the back of the mess line. I got handed the malfunctioning gear during drills. So I did what engineers and medics have always done when brute force fails. I made myself useful in ways brute force couldn't replace.
During week 2, in a live-fire drill, one of the squad's plasma cannons seized mid-engagement. Kessa was screaming into the comms, slamming her fist against the housing, while simulated fire chewed up the ground around her. "Coil's fused!" she roared. "We're losing the angle!" I broke cover before I'd fully decided to, and slid into the trench beside her, medkit doubling as my only toolkit. "Get back, healer! This isn't your—" "Give me 10 seconds and shut up," I snapped, popping the rear access panel. Veil weapons were savage in output, but needlessly complicated in their cooling architecture, a flaw I'd noticed the first day and filed away out of habit. I bypassed the fused coil, rerouted the coolant feed straight to the discharge chamber, and slammed the panel shut.
"Fire," I said. She didn't hesitate. The cannon roared back to life, scorching the mock position downrange. The barrel glowed white-hot without proper cooling, but it held. Kessel looked at the smoking weapon, then down at me. She didn't say thank you. The Veil rarely do. But that night, for the first time, nobody shoved me out of the mess line. It kept happening. A cracked grav harness, I patched it. A malfunctioning targeting visor, I rewired it. A gash that should have gone to the medbay, I stitched shut in the field so the warrior wouldn't lose combat rotation. Slowly, I stopped being the human and started being Doyle. But surviving the barracks and surviving the field were two very different tests. And on the 24th day, the alarms went off, painting the compound in flashing crimson light.
Legion, arm up! The commander's voice thundered over the intercom. Distress beacon from Outpost Kasserine Junction. Varroks have breached the perimeter. This is not a drill. The Varroks, a subterranean swarm species that moved like a flood and cut through armor plating like wet paper. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. The drop pod hit atmosphere hard enough to rattle my fillings loose. When the doors blew open, we walked straight into a slaughterhouse. Outpost Kasserine Junction was a relay station, supposedly hardened against exactly this kind of attack. Instead, it was gutted. Thick black smoke pouring from a ruptured reactor stack. The sky bruised a sickly violet. The air thick with ozone and something rotten underneath it. No bodies, just jagged holes torn straight through solid plating. Command center, the warlord ordered, voice tight. We need the data core before... The ground erupted. V-rocks poured out of the crater in a shrieking wave, chitinous bodies the size of small vehicles, forelimbs crackling with bioelectric current. Ambush! Ring formation! The warlord bellowed, opening fire. The Legion moved like a single organism, forming a tight defensive circle, plasma and kinetic fire tearing into the swarm. I was shoved dead center alongside the comms tech, firing my sidearm into the mass because standing still felt worse than doing something. For every Virox that dropped, 3 more crawled over the corpse to take its place. Then one launched clean over the front line and landed inside the ring, right beside the warlord. Before she could turn, its scythe limb opened her side plate like a tin can.
She went down hard, dark blood pooling into the dust, and the formation cracked instantly. Panic does strange things to even the most disciplined unit, and seeing their matriarch fall broke something in the Legion's spine. The swarm surged into the gap. "Warlord!" Rhine screamed, pinned by 2 drones snapping at her visor. I didn't think. If I'd thought, I would have stayed in the center where it was safest. But every trauma rotation I'd ever run drilled one rule into my skull. When the line breaks, someone has to be the tourniquet. I sprinted, ducking under a scythe swing, and grabbed the warlord by her harness. She was easily 300 pounds in armor, but adrenaline doesn't care about physics. I hauled her backward, firing one-handed into the creature that had struck her, slapped a sealant patch over the breach in her side, and felt the foam hiss and expand under my palm.
"Get off me, healer," she choked, pride fighting past the pain. "Leave me." "Not a chance, warlord," I said, dragging her toward cover. "Fall back to the reactor housing, now!"
Kessa was out of ammo, using her cannon's barrel as a club. Rin was barely holding 2 drones off her own throat. We were seconds from being overrun, and I could feel the math turning against us in real time. "Fall back to the reactor stack!" I screamed over comms. "All of you, now!" "We do not yield ground," Kessa roared. "Do it or we all die here!" I shouted, hauling the warlord's arm over my shoulders. Trained to fight to the last breath, the Legion hesitated. But seeing their commander retreating with me, something in their formation broke and reformed around a new center. They collapsed the perimeter and fell back to the smoking reactor housing at the heart of the outpost.
The Varroks flooded the courtyard behind us, a churning wave of claws and shrieking mandibles. We were pinned against the reactor with nowhere left to go. "They have us," Rin panted, armor dented and smoking, looking at me with something like grim acceptance.
You fought well, Marcus. I'm not finished yet, I said, already ripping the maintenance panel off the reactor casing. Varrock's hunt by tracking bioelectric signatures and ground vibration, a fact buried in a training manual I'd read out of boredom on the transport ride here.
What are you doing? Kessa demanded. Giving them a headache they'll never forget, I said, hands moving fast over the control grid, tearing the safety limiters out one by one. I pulled the incendiary charge off my belt, wedged it into the coolant manifold, and set a 10-second timer.
"Brace!" I screamed, throwing myself over the warlord and pulling her behind the housing's thick metal lip. Kessa and Rin dropped beside us. 3, 2, 1.
Something shifted in that silence. The Veil are pack-bonded, dominance-oriented, brutally traditional. In their culture, males are meant to be sheltered, fragile things kept safe behind walls. I had just dragged their commander out of a kill zone, weaponized a dying reactor, and dropped an entire swarm without losing a single warrior. The warlord reached out and closed her hand around my shoulder. It wasn't the dismissive grip from my first day. It was firm, anchoring, possessive in a way that made my stomach flip. "You," she rumbled, something raw and unreadable in her voice, "are no mere healer, Marcus Doyle."
Kessa stepped closer, eyes burning with an intensity that hadn't been there a week ago. Rin moved to my other side, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off her scorched armor. I realized, with a slow, creeping dread, that the entire dynamic in that courtyard had just inverted. I wasn't the fragile liability anymore. I was something else entirely. Something they intended to keep. Extraction shuttles arrived 20 minutes later. 3 days after that, a Terran liaison officer summoned me to a briefing room and told me, without much apology, that my transfer had never been clerical error at all. It was a sanctioned experiment, testing whether human adaptability could survive inside the galaxy's most rigid warrior culture. I'd been a variable in someone else's research paper. My orders to return to the 62nd were already cut. A shuttle would collect me in 6 hours.
I walked back into the barracks to pack, and the room went silent the second I stepped through the door. "What are you doing?" Kessa asked, standing at the foot of my bunk. "Orders came through," I said quietly. "I'm being reassigned back to my old unit." "No," the warlord said from the doorway, still bandaged, leaning on a cane, somehow just as commanding as ever. She crossed the room and tilted my chin up with one massive hand. "You bled for this Legion. By our oldest law, that makes you ours to keep, not Central Command's to reclaim." I looked around at a room full of 9-foot-tall warriors who, a month ago, wanted to break me in a gravity chamber, and who now looked at me like I was something worth going to war over. I set my duffel back under the bunk.
"Kessa," I said, "your cannon's coolant line is still cycling too slow. Fix that before the next drop, or you'll melt through your own gauntlets." A low, rippling growl of approval rolled through the room, the kind that vibrated the floor plating. The warlord smiled, a sharp, toothy, genuinely warm expression. "Welcome home, Marcus." I didn't mean to join the Ashborn Legion. It started as an experiment run by officers sitting comfortably light years from any actual danger. But sitting on my bunk, surrounded by warriors who'd burned down a star system to keep me safe, I figured I'd come out ahead in the bureaucratic lottery after all. I was the only human in the Ashborn Legion, and I wasn't going anywhere.